At our wedding rehearsal, his mother launched into a public meltdown, mocking my face, my tattoos, my entire being. But instead of walking away, I stood my ground, and when the time came, I showed everyone the secret she buried decades ago. One that changed everything. My name is Marla Reyes. I'm 31, born and raised in Tempe, Arizona, where the sun is sharp, the glance is sharper, and people never forget what you look like. I learned that early, probably the first time a kid recoiled from my face on the school bus and whispered something their mother had said in private, but never meant for me to hear. I was born with a port wine birthmark, deep crimson, crawling, across the left side of my forehead and down past my temple like a spill that stained me permanently. As I got older, it didn't fade. It only deepened in color, like my awareness of it. No amount of makeup ever masked it entirely, not without making me feel like I was layering on someone else's skin. So I stopped trying. I grew into myself, slowly, one scar at a time. The birthmark became something I stopped hiding, though I could never ignore how people reacted to it. Every job interview, every new apartment, every introduction to someone's parents came with that half-second pause, that flash of discomfort. Some tried to disguise it with politeness. Others didn't bother. By the time I met Nathan, I had grown used to the idea that I was always going to be someone people judged before they heard my name. But he never flinched. Nathan was from Albuquerque, but we met at a gallery opening in Flagstaff. I was working as a guest artist, showing some abstract ink pieces that dealt with skin and identity, not subtle, but honest. He stood in front of one for 20 straight minutes, arms folded, head tilted. He looked like he was trying to figure out whether he hated it or loved it, and I liked that about him. We didn't talk that night. He DM'd me the next day through my website's contact form. We went for coffee, then dinner, then 3 years of building something steady and real until it turned into a question over late-night takeout. "Do you think your mom would come if we got married?" I said yes. I didn't ask if his would. Nana. First time I met his mother, Deborah. She hugged me. Not tightly, but just long enough to fake a photo. She told me my eyes were exotic and asked if I'd ever considered laser treatments. Nathan changed the subject before I could respond. I let it slide. 1, 2, 5 comments like that. I let them all slide. There's a quiet calculus you do in those moments. Weighed against love, against peace, against a future. You hold your tongue because saying anything means being labeled dramatic, defensive, difficult. When Nathan proposed, she congratulated us with a polite clap. She said she'd help plan the wedding. I knew she didn't mean mine. Still, I wanted to believe. Wanted to believe love could soften sharp edges, that family could be chosen, even if it came wrapped in judgment. So I said yes to the dress fittings, yes to the bridal shower I wasn't invited to until the last minute, yes to the dinner rehearsals where my name was barely remembered. The day of the rehearsal dinner, I arrived early. My dress was wine red satin, fitted, clean lines, no frills. I wanted to look strong, elegant. I wanted to feel beautiful, no matter what history clung to my skin. I wore my hair straight, a streak of red down one side, echoing the mark on my face. I didn't care if it was too much. I was done shrinking. The venue was a family-owned vineyard just outside Santa Fe. Rustic tables, hanging lights, that Instagram-perfect aesthetic Deborah insisted on, even though it felt like I was being staged into someone else's fantasy. Her fantasy didn't include a bride with a tattooed collarbone and a face she couldn't crop out of the pictures. Guests filtered in slowly. His aunts, uncles, cousins, friends from college. Everyone smiled. Everyone stared just a little too long. Nathan's younger sister brought me a glass of Prosecco and whispered that I looked fierce, which, from her, felt like a genuine compliment. I held on to that like armor. Deborah arrived last. She wore cream, of course. Her lipstick was the exact shade of my birthmark. It felt intentional. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on me, and her smile dropped by a centimeter. She walked straight to the center of the gathering like she was the one getting married. She started giving instructions to the planner, correcting the lighting, rearranging the flowers. When she finally addressed me, it was with a nod that barely acknowledged my existence. I told myself to breathe. That it didn't matter. That the people who mattered knew who I was. That Nathan loved me. Then came the toasts. His uncle spoke. His best friend cracked jokes. Nathan went last, eyes bright, voice steady, hand warm on my back as he talked about the moment he knew he wanted to spend his life with me. I smiled, even though my heart was thudding hard against my ribs. I waited for her turn, knowing it would come, hoping, naively, that it might be neutral, even kind. When Deborah stood up, she held her wine glass high and said my name wrong. Then, she said it again, loudly, clearly, slowly, like it tasted bitter. She talked about how love was blind, about how family had to learn to tolerate differences. She looked at me and said that Nathan always had a soft spot for charity cases, that some women, even with marks on their faces, were lucky to be chosen. She laughed, and others followed, nervously, unsure of whether it was a joke. I stood there, frozen, holding onto the stem of my glass like it was the only thing keeping me from breaking. My birthmark burned hot under the overhead lights. I didn't know where to look. Everyone's faces blurred into one tight, uncomfortable smear of pity and confusion. I heard someone cough, another shift in a chair. Nathan didn't move. Deborah sat down and sipped her wine like nothing had happened. That moment split something open in me. Not just because she humiliated me, but because I realized she wanted to. She had waited for this, planned it. And Nathan hadn't stopped her. He hadn't stood, he hadn't spoken. And that silence, that was louder than anything she said. But I didn't walk out. I stayed. I looked at her. I saw the crack in her mask when she realized I wasn't crying. I saw the flicker of fear when I smiled, just a little, because I knew something she didn't. And it was almost time. The silence that followed Deborah's toast was suffocating. It didn't break with applause or laughter, only with the clink of her glass as she sat down, completely composed. I could feel a dozen sets of eyes on me, then quickly looking away, as if they'd been caught staring. Nathan reached for my hand under the table, but I didn't move. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers clenched so tightly the knuckles ached. The corners of my mouth held a practiced smile, one I'd worn many times before in school hallways, in doctors' offices, in job interviews where people pretended not to see what they clearly couldn't stop looking at. I stood slowly, excused, myself with a calmness that didn't match the chaos in my chest. The air outside was cooler than I expected. It scratched against my lungs like sandpaper. I walked toward the vineyard rows, just far enough away from the murmuring crowd to let the sound of cicadas drown them out. My heels sank into the dirt, and I welcomed the instability beneath my feet. At least it matched what was happening inside. Me. I kept replaying her words, each one hitting harder in the silence than they had in the moment. Charity case. Lucky to be chosen. I'd been called worse, but never in front of the man I loved. Never in a room full of people I was supposed to be calling family in 2 days. There's a particular kind of cruelty in the way some people weaponize politeness. They don't scream. They don't curse. They smile while they slice. Deborah had mastered that art long ago, and she used it like a scalpel tonight. Precise, rehearsed, and designed to leave no visible wound that anyone could point to later. Nathan found me after a while. I heard his footsteps before he spoke. He started to say something. I could feel it on the air between us, but the words never came. Instead, He stood beside me, silent. Like if he stayed long enough, the damage would repair itself. Like he could press pause on the mess and pretend it wasn't bleeding into every part of who we were. I didn't need him to fix anything. I needed him to see. To understand that what just happened wasn't a misunderstanding or a misstep. It was war, and I'd been dragged into it without armor. Later that night, after the last guest had gone and the caterers were packing up trays of untouched food, Deborah cornered me by the kitchen. There were no witnesses, just her, the smell of overcooked rosemary chicken, and the brittle sound of her heels against the stone floor. Her eyes were sharp. Her lips curled in a way that might have looked like a smile if you didn't know better. She didn't apologize. She didn't even pretend to. She said something that lodged in my ribs like splintered bone. That my face, my birthmark, wasn't just unfortunate, it was offensive. That it was a disgrace to be immortalized in wedding photos. That I would always look like a mistake captured on film. That her friends would never understand why someone like me would be standing beside her son in a white dress. She said that I was an embarrassment, not just to her, but to the Reyes name, as if by marrying Nathan, I would be infecting the family with my difference. I stood there, barely breathing, wondering how someone could be so venomous without raising their voice. She called it tradition, pride, standards. But I saw the truth in her eyes. Fear. Not of me, but of what I represented. A woman who refused to hide. A woman who bore her so-called flaw in the open. A woman who didn't ask for permission to take up space. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not then. I knew that if I opened my mouth, it wouldn't stop at words. It would spill out all the years I had swallowed, every humiliation, every time I had been told I was brave, just for existing, every backhanded compliment, every time someone tried to make my skin their lesson in tolerance. I walked past her, steady and slow, because if I stopped for even a second, I would crumble. And I wasn't going to give her that. Nathan didn't ask what she said. Not that night. Not the next morning either. He must have known. Or maybe he didn't want to. Maybe he thought if he ignored it, it would dissolve like mist. But it didn't. It thickened. It filled every space between us until even his touch felt distant. I caught him staring at me more often, his eyes lingering on my birthmark longer than they used to. Not with disgust, with worry. Like he was trying to measure how much more I could take before I broke. The day before the wedding, I sat alone in the bridal suite provided by Deborah. It was beige and cold and smelled like a hotel room scrubbed too hard to feel human. My dress hung in the corner, pristine and untouched. I traced the edge of my tattoo through the fabric of my robe, the one that curled just beneath the red splash. On my collarbone, a wing, black ink. It had been my first act of defiance at 19, after a stranger in the grocery store asked if I was in a fire. The wing was my reminder. Of freedom. Of rising. Of not explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was. There was a knock at the door. When I opened it, it was one of Deborah's cousins, a woman I barely knew. She handed me a gold envelope. Inside was a note, handwritten in delicate cursive. It was from Deborah. One sentence. You still have time to do the right thing and walk away. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the letter like it was made of glass. My fingers trembled, but not with sadness, with rage. Cold, clear, purposeful rage. Because I finally understood. This wasn't about tradition or aesthetics or family pride. This was about erasure. She didn't want me to leave for Nathan's sake. She wanted me to disappear for hers. Because people like Deborah survive by rewriting history, by making sure anything that doesn't fit their narrative is removed, erased, silenced. But I wasn't going anywhere. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Not to return it, but to keep it. Because it was proof. Of what? She thought of me, of who she really was. And I had more than just a birthmark and a tattoo. I had something she didn't know about. A name, a paper trail, a truth that she had buried for decades and never expected to see again. And soon, she would. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. The suite was silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the far wall, a sound that seemed louder with every second. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, not thinking about flowers, or vows, or first dances. I was thinking about her, Deborah, the woman who would soon be tied to me by law, by photographs, by name. The woman who had spent every moment since our engagement pretending I didn't belong while making sure everyone knew exactly why. Something about that envelope changed everything. I'd been balancing on a thread ever since Nathan proposed, smiling. Through her slights, absorbing her disapproval like it was part of the cost of love. But that note, so casual in its cruelty, was a shift. It wasn't passive anymore. It was a threat. It was an ultimatum dressed in gold cardstock. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman who looked back. Not because I felt broken, but because I felt something rising in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. The kind of quiet certainty that comes after a long silence, like breath returning after being underwater. I traced the edge of my birthmark with my fingertip, not in shame, but in thought. I wasn't going to disappear, and if she wanted to play with truths, she should have remembered that the past doesn't always stay buried. It started with a phone call, not to Nathan, not to anyone on his side, but to my Aunt Teresa, who had raised me after my mom passed when I was 9. Teresa, who always spoke like she knew more than she let on, who once told me that blood doesn't always behave, but secrets always surface. She answered on the first ring. I didn't need to explain much. She knew the weight in my voice. She told me to check the box she'd kept in her attic, the one marked with my mother's initials. She said she never opened it but knew one day I would need to. I drove 6 hours that morning, alone, no calls, no texts. The drive from Santa Fe to Tempe felt like crossing into another version of myself. The desert rolled past in waves of burnt gold and dry heat. I kept thinking about Deborah's eyes, about the way they narrowed every time she looked at me. The kind of stare that searched for something to disapprove of. Something familiar, maybe. The kind of stare that wasn't just hateful. It was haunted. The box was there, exactly where Teresa said it would be, tucked in the far corner beneath old Christmas lights and broken kitchen chairs. It was smaller than I expected, just a shoebox wrapped in a rubber band. I took it without opening it. I wanted the truth on my own terms. I wanted it to unfold in silence. Back in my car, I parked on a quiet street and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, faded, curled at the edges, soft with time. My mother, young and glowing, her arms wrapped around a baby I knew was me. A hospital bracelet with my name handwritten on it. A letter in my mother's handwriting addressed to no one, and then another envelope. This one sealed, crisp, newer than the rest. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. Inside was a birth certificate. Mine. But not the one I had. This one listed a different name in the field for mother. Not my mother's, Deborah's. My hands trembled. I checked again. Name, date, time, hospital, all matched. But the mother's name, Deborah Elise Morgan, before she was married, before she became who she is now. I sat in that car for what felt like hours. Time collapsed into a blur. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady. Strangely steady. Like my body already knew the truth, and the paper was just a confirmation, a formality. I thought back to all the things that didn't add up. The way she looked at me, the hesitation in her voice when she said my name. The photos missing from Nathan's childhood albums, the years that were always glossed over. Her sudden hostility from the moment I entered her life, like I had trespassed into something sacred and unspoken. She knew. She had always known. I imagined. The moment she saw Nathan fall in love with me, the panic that must have swept over her, the dread, the recognition, and the shame she buried so deep that she built an entire version of herself around it. But shame has cracks, and the more you try to seal them, the more they find ways to split open. The following morning, I returned to the vineyard. Nobody noticed. I'd been gone. Or maybe they did, but no one said anything. Deborah was already there, adjusting the seating chart like it was her own coronation. I watched her from a distance, watched the way her fingers shook just slightly when she didn't. Think anyone was looking? The way her eyes flicked toward me every few seconds, then away again just as quickly. The cracks were there, small, but spreading. She pulled me aside later to ask about the dress fitting. Her voice was brittle, her words too measured. I said nothing. Just looked at her, held her stare longer than I ever had, and I saw it. The flicker of something behind her perfect composure. Not anger, not disgust, but recognition. Like staring into a mirror you've tried to break only to see your reflection clearer in the fragments. She didn't ask about my trip. She didn't ask why I looked different, calmer, more rooted. She didn't need to. And I didn't tell her what I had found. Not yet. I wanted her to feel it first. The shift. The weight of truth pressing against the seams of the life she had built. I wanted her to walk into the ceremony with the knowledge that something was coming, something she couldn't control or contain, that no amount of money or manners or threats could stop it. I spent the rest of the day in silence, watching, waiting, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the moment when truth would no longer be a secret and her world, so carefully polished, would finally begin to crack in front of everyone, and I would be the one holding the first shard. The morning of the wedding rehearsal, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was a dull, washed-out gray, like it couldn't decide whether to rain or just linger with that oppressive waiting kind of silence. Everyone moved around the venue, as if everything was normal. Flowers were being delivered. The planner was shouting into her headset. Bridesmaids were trying on matching robes and taking selfies. But I could feel something brittle under the surface, like we were all walking on glass. And I knew I was the one holding the hammer. I watched Deborah from a distance. Her dress was pale lilac this time, soft and expensive looking. Her hair pulled into a sculpted twist that probably took 2 hours and 3 professionals to achieve. She looked immaculate, like always. But up close, I could see it. The strain around her mouth. The way she avoided direct eye contact with me. The way her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted a place card. It wasn't fear of the event going wrong. It was fear of me. Nathan had no idea what I had uncovered. I hadn't told him, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted him to hear it when everyone else did. I needed to tell it once, fully, without softening it for his sake. I wasn't going to whisper it in a quiet room. It had lived too long in whispers, already. And then there was his father. I hadn't spent much time with Arthur. He was quiet, the kind of man who made himself small in a room, even when he took up physical space. He rarely spoke unless directly asked, and even then his words were brief, careful. He had the same blue-gray eyes as Nathan, but none of his warmth. He always felt distant, like a photograph left out in the sun. Familiar, but faded. I had noticed the way he watched me. Not the way Deborah did, with distaste and calculation, but with something closer to sorrow. From the first dinner I had, with their family, He had looked at me like I reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. There was no malice in it, just a kind of persistent ache. I used to think it was guilt by association, being married to someone like Deborah, watching her tear through people with a smile, but now I wondered if it was more than that, if he knew. During the rehearsal, as everyone filed into their places, I caught him standing alone near the arbor. He was staring out across the vineyard, hands folded behind his back, his shoulders slumped like he carried something too old to name. I stood near him, not speaking, just letting the silence stretch between us like a thread. He glanced at me once, then back to the vines. His eyes didn't linger, but something in them shifted. Recognition, again. Or maybe resignation. Later, as everyone gathered inside the reception hall to practice the toasts, he took his seat beside Deborah without a word. She fussed with his tie, straightened his cuff, all without asking if he cared. He let her. He always let her. But when Nathan began to speak, thanking everyone for being part of our day, Arthur looked directly at me. Just for a second. And I saw it. Saw the thing he'd been carrying. Not fear, not confusion, but shame. Old shame. Heavy shame. The kind that lives in silence for decades. The moment passed, but the feeling stayed. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unknow what I now knew. After the rehearsal, as people began to disperse for dinner, I found a quiet hallway near the kitchen. I needed space. I needed a second to breathe, to steady myself for what was coming. That's when Arthur appeared. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me like he had something to say, and no idea how to say it. His hands were trembling, barely, but enough to notice. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he nodded, just once, slowly, and turned to go. That nod said everything. It said he knew. It said he had known for years, and it said he had chosen to stay silent. I watched him walk away, the weight of his choice trailing behind him like smoke. He had lived with the truth longer than I had even been alive, and in all that time, he had never spoken it aloud. Maybe he thought he was protecting someone. Maybe he believed the silence was safer. But all it had done was feed the lie until it grew strong enough to infect everything it touched. Back in the main room, Deborah was holding court, laughing with her friends, pretending like nothing in the world could touch her. But her laughter was too loud, too forced, like she was trying to drown out something no one else could hear. I watched her hand reach for her glass and noticed the way her fingers trembled just slightly as they touched the stem. A twitch, barely there, but present. I realized then that Arthur's silence was not just complicity, it was survival. But his silence also spoke volumes. It screamed in the quiet. It told me that the story I had uncovered wasn't just my own. It was bigger, older. It was a wound passed down, hidden in wedding photos and sealed envelopes, never named, but always there. I went back to my suite that night and opened the box again. I looked at the photos, the letters, the documents. I studied my mother's face in the pictures, her eyes wide and tired and full of something I could finally recognize. Fear and love tangled into one. I reread the letter she had written but never sent. The one where she spoke of being pressured, of choices taken from her, of promises broken. She never named names, but now I knew them. I folded the letter and slid it into my clutch. Tomorrow, I would carry it with me, because the truth wasn't just about Deborah's shame or Arthur's silence. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen before I even had words for it. And tomorrow, when I stood in front of that room full of people, dressed in white, with my name on the program and the weight of history in my hands, I wouldn't be asking for acceptance. I would be taking back the story that was mine all along. It was the night before the wedding, and the house was buzzing with final touches and soft chaos. People running checklists, steaming dresses, laying out jewelry, pressing napkins into perfect folds. I had slipped away quietly, unnoticed, retreating, to the far end of the estate, where the noise faded, and the lights from the main hall looked like distant stars through the trees. The vineyards whispered in the breeze, their long rows like silent witnesses to everything this place had tried to hide. I sat on a weathered bench beneath an old fig tree, the air warm and dry against my skin. In my lap rested the clutch I'd carried all day, the letter from my mother still folded inside. I hadn't told Nathan anything. I hadn't confronted Deborah. I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed. But my body felt like a held breath, like the moment just before thunder splits the sky, and I knew that something was going to break. As I sat there, I thought about my mother, her voice, soft and distant in my memory, her hands, always warm, the way she used to look at me when I was small and afraid to go outside because kids would point and laugh at the mark on my face. She never told me I was beautiful to make me feel better. She told me I was fierce. She told me that the things that made people uncomfortable were the same things that made me unforgettable. But what she never told me, not once, was anything about where I truly came from. That there was another woman, another name, a hidden beginning carefully erased. I thought about Teresa too. The way she'd always been half-truthful, keeping just enough of the past close without fully opening the door. I used to think she was just being protective, shielding me from pain. But maybe she was waiting. Maybe she knew the day would come when I'd need to see it for myself, when I'd be strong enough to hold it without letting it crush me. And now here I was, staring into the darkness and realizing it had shape, and a name, and a face I'd sat across from at dinner tables and bridal showers. I replayed the look on Arthur's face, that moment of fragile eye contact before he turned away. He hadn't said anything because he didn't need to. His silence had already spoken everything I needed to know. He'd known the truth all along, and somewhere deep inside, he'd mourned it every day. Maybe he hadn't agreed with what had happened. Maybe he'd wanted to do the right thing once. But he hadn't. He'd kept quiet, like so many others. Like the entire machine that turns secrets into silence and calls it protection. The wind shifted and I heard laughter from the house, a burst of joy that felt so distant, like it belonged to someone else. I closed my eyes and leaned back, letting the weight of everything press down on me. There, in that quiet, something settled inside. Not rage, not sadness, just a kind of sharp, electric clarity. I saw everything clearly for the first time. Deborah hadn't just tried to erase me from this wedding. She had tried to erase me from the beginning. She had built her entire identity, wife, mother, social matriarch, on the foundation of a lie. I was a crack in that foundation, one she had ignored for decades until I walked into her son's life like a ghost she thought she'd buried. Every glare, every insult, every cold smile had been her desperation, her attempt to keep the truth from surfacing, because she wasn't just ashamed of me. She was terrified that the girl she gave away had grown up to become someone too strong to be ignored. Terrified that the secret she had locked in a dusty file would one day sit across from her in a white dress with her name on the invitations. Terrified that her world wasn't unbreakable. I stood up from the bench and looked back at the house. Its windows glowed with soft gold light, full of people who didn't know the story unfolding around them. People who were laughing, eating, clinking glasses, celebrating a union that was about to become something much more complicated than they expected. Tomorrow wasn't going to be the fairy tale Deborah had crafted. It was going to be a reckoning. But I wasn't afraid, because the part of me that had spent years trying to shrink, to stay polite, to not be too loud, too strange, too marked. That part had burned away in the vineyard air. In its place was something still and immovable. I wasn't just someone's daughter. I wasn't just the girl with the birthmark. I wasn't even just the bride. I was the truth. And I had found my place. Not just beside Nathan, but at the center of a story that had tried to keep me at its edge. Tomorrow, I would speak. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. In justice. The kind of justice that doesn't shout but stands still, unmoving, unshakable. I walked back slowly, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. My shadow followed me, long and sure, stretching out under the pale moonlight. I thought about my mother's arms, about Teresa's attic, about Arthur's nod, about Deborah's trembling hands. I thought about Nathan, his softness, his love, his confusion. He didn't know yet, but he would, and after tomorrow, none of us would ever be the same again. The sun rose without ceremony, dull and pale behind a veil of clouds, as if even the sky sensed what was coming. The vineyard was already stirring when I arrived, servers unloading trays, florists making last-minute adjustments, voices echoing, off the stone walls with a kind of anxious energy that didn't match the occasion. Today was supposed to be the final rehearsal, the last step before the ceremony. But I knew better. Today was not a rehearsal. It was the beginning of something real. I wore white. Not the wedding dress, not yet. A simple, tailored white jumpsuit that hugged my frame like armor. My hair was pinned back, exposing everything. My birthmark, my tattoo, the curve of my jaw. Nothing hidden, nothing softened. I had painted my lips the color of blood. I wanted her to see me. I wanted everyone to see. The hall where the rehearsal was set felt too polished, too clean. It smelled like cut roses and lemon oil, like something preserved instead of lived in. Deborah stood near the center, holding a clipboard she didn't need, giving orders no one had asked for. Her voice was tight, sharp in its cheerfulness. She moved from table to table, adjusting silverware by a millimeter, her eyes flicking toward me every few seconds but never landing. She knew I was there, and she knew why. Arthur sat near the back, quiet, folded into himself like a man watching, the final act of a play he helped write but never believed would be performed. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. I saw the note in his pocket, the same envelope I had left for him outside his door that morning, containing a copy of the birth certificate and my mother's letter. He hadn't spoken to me since, but he hadn't looked away either. Nathan was caught in the whirlwind of last-minute details, bouncing between relatives and vendors, smiling in that distracted way that told me he still didn't sense the fault line running beneath us. He hadn't read the letter. He hadn't seen the documents. I had kept them close, waiting for the moment they would no longer be private. Today, I would stop protecting the silence. The planner called for everyone to take their places. Chairs were arranged, the aisle cleared. People settled in, murmuring with anticipation. Deborah took her seat in the front row, legs crossed at the ankle, fingers gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. I stood at the back of the aisle, hands calm, pulse steady. When the music began, I didn't move. Instead, I stepped forward, not to walk the aisle, but to take the microphone from the officiant. The music faded, confused glances ricocheted through the room, and Deborah froze mid-breath. I looked out at the room, at faces full of expectation, at a man I loved who didn't yet understand that the ground beneath his feet was about to shift. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch, let it settle over the room like dust, heavy and revealing. And then I began. I told them my name. Not just the one they knew, but the name I had found in that box in Teresa's attic. The one written in fading ink, given to me by a woman who had no choice but to let me go. I told them about my mother, about the letter, about the hospital records. I told them about Deborah. I didn't accuse. I didn't scream. I simply laid out the truth, piece by piece, as if I were returning stolen objects to their rightful place. The room shifted. Eyes widened. Mouths opened, closed again. Arthur didn't move. Nathan stood slowly, a question forming behind his eyes. And Deborah tried to stand to speak, but her voice caught in her throat like glass. I turned to her then. I looked at her fully, with nothing between us. I told her that I wasn't angry that she gave me away. I was angry that she had pretended I didn't exist, that she had looked me in the face, knowing, and still chose cruelty. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Her hands were trembling now, visibly, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and she was powerless to stop it. I stepped forward again and held out the letter, letting it hang in the space between us. She didn't reach for it. The planner tried to intervene, whispered something to the officiant, but no one else moved. No one dared to break the moment. The silence was a living thing, thick and sacred. I turned back to the guests, to the family I was supposed to be joining. I told them that this wasn't the day I had planned, that I hadn't come to break anything, only to show them what was already broken. I looked at Nathan last. He hadn't spoken, but his eyes were wet, his jaw tight. He took a step toward me and stopped. I told him that I loved him, that I still did. But love couldn't live inside a lie. That maybe we could find our way back, maybe not. But I couldn't begin our story standing in the shadow of someone else's silence. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just sat there, stunned, in the aftermath of truth. I left the microphone on the table and walked down the aisle, not as a bride, but as myself. Fully, finally. The hall behind me filled with whispers, questions, disbelief. But I didn't look back. I walked through the double doors into the warm afternoon light, feeling the sun on my skin, unfiltered, unafraid. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of soil and grapes and something cleaner, something new. The rehearsal had become a stage, and I had stepped into the role I was always meant to play, not the bride, the storm. The house was quiet when I returned later that evening. The guests had long since cleared out. The florist's van was gone, the folding chairs stacked in a corner of the lawn, and the string lights flickered gently in the breeze like they hadn't, borne witness to everything that had come crashing down just hours before. Inside, the halls echoed in that hollow way places do after something big happens, like the walls were still absorbing what they'd heard, trying to understand it. I didn't expect to find anyone there. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Maybe closure. Maybe confrontation. Maybe just a final breath before the whole thing disappeared behind me. The kitchen light was on. I followed the faint hum of the refrigerator, the low crackling pop of something burning. The moment I stepped into the room, I knew. The smell of scorched paper was unmistakable, thin, acrid, full of desperation. She was standing there, bent over the farmhouse sink, one hand holding a pair of tongs, the other hovering over the flickering flame of a ceramic candle jar. Her eyes snapped to mine, wide with shock, but only for a second. Then they narrowed. Then she turned away, calmly, like I had caught her rinsing a glass, not destroying the last traces of a life she'd tried to erase. The envelope was half charred, the corner of my birth certificate curling into black at the edges. Another document sat beside it, still intact. An adoption form, unsigned, unstamped, dated months after I had already been born. Her name scrawled at the bottom in familiar, spiky penmanship. There were notes in the margins. Crossed out names. Corrections. Red ink slashed across dates that didn't align. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a cover-up, rewritten again and again to protect a narrative she couldn't let go of. I didn't move. Neither did she. We stood there for what felt like a year, separated by a few feet and 3 decades of silence. The candle hissed and spat as another corner blackened and fell into ash. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Everything was in her eyes: panic, shame, fury, but most of all, fear. The kind that comes not from being caught, but from being seen. I stepped forward and plucked the half-burned page from the tongs before she could finish. It was hot, but not unbearable. The ink was still visible. Enough remained to prove everything. I set it aside gently, like I was placing a memory where it belonged. She watched me with tight lips, trembling hands. There was nothing left for her to say. No denial that could hold up against the pages she had tried to destroy. No apology that wouldn't ring hollow. Too late. Too rehearsed. I opened the kitchen drawer she had left ajar. Inside, among the measuring spoons and elastic bands, was the rest of the envelope I had delivered to Arthur, torn but untouched. She had gotten to it before he could. Or maybe he had given it to her. I couldn't tell. What mattered was that she had read every word, and she had decided that if truth couldn't be denied, it would be burned. I gathered the pages carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles, separating the salvageable from the lost. My mother's letter was singed along the edge, but the words still glowed in her looping cursive. Her pain, her hope, her helplessness. And now, my resolve. Deborah didn't stop me as I turned to leave the room. She stood there like a statue, drowning in a silence she had built stone by stone, now crumbling around her. Maybe she thought she could still fix it. Maybe she believed, deep down, that if she could make the evidence disappear, the truth would follow. But that's the thing about truth. It waits. It doesn't care how long you hide it. It stays patient, solid, buried if it must be, but never gone. I walked through the halls with the documents pressed to my chest, my breath steady, my steps slow. The house felt unfamiliar now, like I'd stepped into the ruins of a place that had never really existed. Every framed picture on the walls, every decorative vase and antique book seemed to mock the illusion she had created. A family held together by performance, by secrecy, by curated perfection. But the cracks were visible now, and no amount of ceremony could fill them. I went to my room and locked the door, spread the documents across the bed, took photographs of every page that had survived, scanned them, filed them, sent them to Teresa, sent them to myself, saved them in 3 different clouds. I wasn't taking any more chances. Her fire had already eaten too much of my history. It wouldn't take what remained. Sitting there, staring at the evidence, I finally understood why she had tried so hard to destroy it. Because it was never about protecting Nathan or Arthur. It wasn't even about protecting her reputation. It was about control. About a woman who had once made a choice that shattered her, and instead of healing from it, built a kingdom of denial and demanded everyone kneel. But kingdoms fall, and queens are human. The candle still burned in the kitchen. I could smell it from the hallway. The scent of melted wax and scorched paper would linger in that house for days, maybe longer. Maybe she would smell it every time she walked into the room. A reminder, a warning, a ghost. And I would carry the pages, not as a weapon, but as proof that I had survived her silence. Tomorrow I would wear white, and this time I would not walk alone. The morning light filtered in through the sheer curtains, soft and golden, casting long streaks across the floorboards of the guest room I had slept in alone. The vineyard outside was still quiet, dew clinging to the vines, the sky clear for the first time in days. There was a stillness in the air, not empty, but waiting, charged, like the world was holding its breath. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, barefoot, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, feeling the weight of the day pressing gently on my shoulders. It wasn't dread. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something settled. The dress hung in front of the full-length mirror. Not a symbol, not a costume, just fabric, just a thing I would wear while I stood in front of people and told them, without apology, who I was. I dressed slowly, methodically. Every motion felt deliberate. The zipper, the buttons, the comb in my hair. I didn't try to hide the mark on my face. I didn't contour or cover. I let it stand, unmasked, like a banner. My tattoo was visible, just beneath the soft neckline, inked proof of everything I had become. Outside, guests began to arrive. Their voices floated up through the window, low and excited, touched by that particular buzz of weddings where everyone dresses like it's a holiday and pretends that nothing ugly has ever happened. But today was not about pretending. Not for me. I stepped out into the corridor and walked toward the main hall. Every footstep echoed in the silence of the house. A steady rhythm, not rushed, not hesitant. Deborah wasn't in sight. I wondered where she was, what face she'd put on for today, what script she'd try to follow now that the truth was no longer hiding in shadows. I wondered if Arthur had spoken to her since last night, if he'd told her he knew, if he had finally said out loud the things that lived behind his silence. When I entered the room, the music didn't stop, but the shift was palpable. Heads turned, conversation stilled. I saw familiar faces freeze in half smiles. There were stares, some confused, others cautious, some filled with quiet admiration. Nathan stood near the arbor, dressed in charcoal gray, eyes locked on mine. He didn't move. He just watched me, searching, as though the woman walking toward him was both someone he'd always known and someone entirely new. I walked past rows of people, past the flowers and the flickering candles and the carefully arranged chairs. I walked with my spine straight, my hands steady, my eyes forward. I felt every glance. I welcomed them. I felt no shame. When I reached the front, I didn't wait for the officiant. I turned to face the guests. The whole room opened before me and began to speak. Not loud, not theatrical, just clear, just true. I told them everything. I told them I was Deborah's daughter, that years ago she had given me away, that I had grown up never knowing where I came from, never knowing why the mirror made people uncomfortable. I told them that I had found out the truth not through love, not through confession, but through evidence that had almost been burned. I saw the shock ripple through the room, heard the whispering, watched Deborah stand slowly at the edge of the crowd, lips parted but no sound coming. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. She didn't deny it. She didn't speak. And I didn't wait for her to. I told them that. I was not ashamed. That the blood in my veins did not need permission to matter. That my face, my skin, my birthmark were not curses, not flaws, not burdens. They were mine. They were proof that I had lived, endured, become. That I had loved and been loved in return. I turned to Nathan then. His eyes were full, his face unreadable, for a moment. Then he stepped forward, not to speak, but to take my hand. And I let him. Because even in the wreckage, even after everything had been torn open and exposed, what we had was still there, bruised maybe, but real. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if he could forgive the silence I had kept, or if I could forgive his. But I knew that I wanted to find out. The ceremony continued, not as it had been planned, but as it needed to be, without pageantry, without perfection. Just people, flawed and trembling, trying to love each other better. Afterward, there was no bouquet toss, no first dance, just soft conversations, a few tight embraces, a handful of people coming up to say they never knew, that they were sorry, that I was brave. But I didn't feel brave. I felt clean. Like I had rinsed the lie from my bones and was standing in the open air for the first time. Deborah never approached me. She stood alone for most of the evening, surrounded by no one, staring out over the vineyard like it might swallow her. Maybe it already had. I don't know what she felt. I don't know if she will ever change. I don't need her to. Before the night ended, I walked to the edge of the vineyard alone. The wind moved through the vines in slow waves. I looked up at the sky, dotted with stars, and breathed in deeply. Not out of relief, not out of triumph, but because I could. I am not a secret. I am not an accident. I am not her shame. I am the bride, and I am her daughter.